Welcome to History on the Highway on West Star Media. Tune us in, turn us up, and tear the knob off, baby. Hey, I'm your host, Stan Ellsworth. And today, we're going to keep talking revolution. You thought it was over? No, man. Real revolutions never end. They just keep right on going. And the American Industrial Revolution was one of the best. In the second half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, the United States would see a boom in heavy industry. Railroads, oil, steel, all the infrastructure that the United States would need to step up onto the big stage. The American Industrial Revolution started off with a bang, and it was walking hand in hand with the westward expansion of the United States, right up until the sectional differences between the North and the South put the brakes on. And boy, did they stop progress. Everybody'd have to wait while the North and the South worked out their troubles. After the war, there were men, the captains of industry, we'll call them, that saw in the chaos opportunity. And it was their drive, their vision, their ambition, their ingenuity that laid the foundation and built the infrastructure that would help America rise and become a world power. One of the first great entrepreneurs of this age, of the Gilded Age, was Cornelius Vanderbilt. Now, Vanderbilt was kind of an average Joe as a kid. He had a modest education, but what he did have was an eager eye and a shrewd mind for business practice. Vanderbilt began with just one ship, and he entered the ferry business from Staten Island and New Jersey to Manhattan and Long Island. It wasn't long before Vanderbilt had a fleet of 5 ships. Now, the guys that ran the bigger operations there in the harbor, they jokingly referred to Vanderbilt as the Commodore, almost to insult him. It wasn't long, though, before Vanderbilt ran that harbor. Everything from the Verrazano Narrows back to Manhattan was under the control of the Commodore. Vanderbilt was making money hand over fist. He actually became the only ferry service in the harbor. Now, with the advent of steam, Vanderbilt quickly transitioned from sail power to steam engines. And his steamships not only were the backbone of the ferry service, but also became a very lucrative aspect of the textile trade. It was Vanderbilt ships that sailed back and forth across New York Sound, carrying the textile products made in New England to market on Long Island and Manhattan. And Vanderbilt didn't stop there. With the discovery of gold in California, it was the Vanderbilt steam lines that would carry those dreamers that were seeking to prospect and stake their claim in the gold fields of California, would carry them from New York City all the way to San Francisco, where they could stock up and head into the hills. Vanderbilt's steam lines made him wealthy beyond anyone's imaginings. And then came that awful war. With the outbreak of war, Vanderbilt, a strong Union man, immediately went to the Secretary of the Navy and offered his ships, his steel-bottomed ships, for use in the blockade of the Confederacy. He wanted this war to end, because let's face it, Vanderbilt was a businessman, and this war was bad for business. He wasn't in the arms trade. He wasn't making money, but he also loved the Union. The Secretary of War, Edmund Stanton, didn't see a need for Vanderbilt ships and dismissed him. With the outbreak of war, Vanderbilt immediately offered his ships, his steel-bottomed ships, to the United States Navy. He wanted the Navy to use them in the blockade of the Confederacy and bring this war to a rapid end. It wasn't good for business. Vanderbilt thought peace was much better, and he loved the Union. He wanted to see the nation stay together. But the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, didn't see the point. He thought the war was going to be very short, so he dismissed Vanderbilt. Didn't see a need for his ships. That was right up until the Confederate ironclad, CSS Virginia, sailed down out of Richmond and started shooting hell out of the Yankee ships. The whole fleet was in danger. Suddenly, Vanderbilt's ships were very valuable. Now, at the end of the war, Vanderbilt got his ships back, and his steam line went back into operation, and he was making money again. But Vanderbilt's interest had grown. He now wanted to consolidate the railroads, and he bought up all the railroads in New England and New York. Vanderbilt's the man that actually constructed Grand Central Station. And you know all those railroads that you play with on the Monopoly board? Yep, you guessed it. All Vanderbilt lines. By the time Vanderbilt was done with his huge transportation conglomerate, he was worth over $185 billion in today's money. Fortunately, Vanderbilt was a great philanthropist as well as a shrewd businessman. One of the greatest industrialists and entrepreneurs of the Gilded Age was Andrew Carnegie. Now let's get the debate out of the way right here off the top. The way the name is pronounced in the United States is Carnegie, and the way it's pronounced in Scotland is Carnegie. So both are correct. You can say it either way. I don't think he cares. Now, Carnegie's family comes from Dunfermline in Scotland, and he was the son of a poor tailor. They were so poor, in fact, that the family had to indenture themselves to book passage to the United States to find new opportunity. And Carnegie's first experience in the new industrialized America was as a bobbin boy, one of the young boys that would work in a textile mill and trade out the spools of thread that made these yards and yards of textile. These kids would work for basically a dime a day. Carnegie's next opportunity was as a mail boy, running telegraphic messages back and forth through the factories. But whenever he had a moment, Carnegie was reading. He knew that to be involved in the circles where he wanted to go, he had to have an education. And neither time nor monetary funds allowed him that opportunity. Carnegie was a self-made man, and he always was reading. Now, Carnegie had a couple of things going for him. He always seemed to be in the right place at the right time, and he always seemed to be able to make friends out of the right people. It was while he was running telegraphic messages that Carnegie began to make friends with investment bankers. And Carnegie had several ideas, but he didn't have the cash to make it work. But through careful borrowing and insightful investment, it wasn't long before Carnegie had amassed a small fortune. You see, he knew the right folks, people that would stake him in an investment. And he was shrewd, just like our boy Vanderbilt. And when the money came in, it came in by the bucket load. Pretty soon, Carnegie was a junior partner in several telegraphic interests, as well as some railroad concerns. And then came that awful war. Now, many wealthy men in the North were allowed to pay substitutes to go to war in their place. Carnegie tried twice to enlist, but was told that because of his managerial and supervisory positions in the telegraph and railroad business, his job was too important to the war effort to allow him to serve as a soldier. But early in the war, when the Confederates were cutting the telegraph lines to Washington, D.C., it was Carnegie that would ride the rails and repair the lines. Many other people were too scared to do it. But Carnegie would head out, repair the lines, often under fire, and once being wounded. That didn't intimidate him. I mean, heck, he's a Scotsman. He's not going to back down from a fight. Now, after the war, Carnegie had become a principal individual in many of the northern railroads. But Carnegie's interest had turned to the foundation of American industrial might. Carnegie's name would be synonymous with steel. After the war, Carnegie took the money that he had and invested in steel. Carnegie was very wise. He didn't believe in waste. He brought a number of steel concerns together and created the strongest steel corporation in the United States. Carnegie saw what the Bessemer process, this new way of making steel, made it stronger, made it more resilient. He saw what steel could be. He saw it as the backbone of the new United States. And it was Carnegie steel that spanned the rivers and built the bridges. It was Carnegie steel that built the great ocean liners of the Gilded Age. It was Carnegie steel that built the railroads that ran from east to west and connected the United States from sea to shining sea. Carnegie saw what steel could be, and he rode that horse right to $309 billion. Now, you got to understand that Carnegie's wealth was only half of the equation to him. Carnegie said that no man really obtains riches unless he enriches others. Personally, he had a motto. He figured that the first 20 years of his life were for learning, and he tried to learn all he could. The second 20 years were for earning, and he tried to earn everything he could. And the rest of his life was for giving back. He called it learn, earn, and return. And Andrew Carnegie was one hell of a philanthropist. Carnegie was also very frugal. Let me tell you, this guy was smart with his money. He knew a good bargain when he saw it. And if Carnegie saw this Quip electric toothbrush, he'd have jumped on the opportunity. He saw the value. Okay, honest, man. Quip is value. This thing will pay for itself. I mean, it takes the work out of brushing your teeth. It takes the guesswork out of doing the business. You know what I'm saying? This thing makes your teeth bright and shiny. You're supposed to brush them 2 minutes every time. Nobody does that. But Quip has a 30-second timer. Tells you when you got to be done and move on. And that's why I love Quip. Quip is approved by 20,000 dental professionals. It's received over 5,000 five-star reviews. Let me tell you, baby, Quip is the way to go. They start at $25. Go to getquip.com/HTH right now, and you're going to get your first set of replacement bristles for free. That's getquip.com/HTH. Get Quip, baby, and get it now. One of the wealthiest men that's ever lived is John D. Rockefeller. Now, there might have been a pharaoh in Egypt or an emperor in China that had more wealth, but I don't think so. And if so, not by much. Rockefeller was worth better than $400 billion in our money today. Now, Rockefeller was born literally the son of a snake oil salesman. His daddy was a charlatan. He was a philanderer. He was a bigamist. Papa was a rolling stone. Okay, but believe it or not, Rockefeller's mother was a strong Baptist woman. She was a good woman and taught her family sound morals and a good work ethic. Rockefeller loved his mom. And when the time came that he could help the family, Rockefeller became the breadwinner. He started out as a bookkeeper and a purveyor of dry goods. In fact, that's what he was doing when that war broke out. Now, because Rockefeller was the only hope for the family during the war, he paid a substitute to go to war for him, to take his place on the line. His mom and the other kids would have gone without if he'd have left the business. Now, it was during the war that petroleum, oil, was discovered in Pennsylvania, and Rockefeller and several of his friends invested in a couple of drilling concerns, and they made money. Now, you see, before the American Civil War, the only oil that was used to light anything was whale oil, and it was expensive. The common man was still using candles for his family. But with the advent of this new petroleum oil, things were going to change. And Rockefeller and his buddies were wise investors. It wasn't long before they'd made quite a bit of money and got out of the drilling business and opened their own refinery in Cleveland, Ohio. And refining petroleum made John D. Rockefeller wealthy beyond anyone's wildest dreams. So Rockefeller and his associates opened their own refinery in Cleveland, Ohio, Now, the difference between Rockefeller's petroleum concern and everybody else's was from a hard, younger life, Rockefeller had learned, waste not, want not. If you watch your pennies, your pounds take care of themselves. Rockefeller even saved gasoline, which at the time was seen as kind of a byproduct of petroleum distillation. Now, it wasn't really the wisdom of his investments, nor even the petroleum, that made Rockefeller wealthy. It was his entrepreneurial savvy. You see, when Rockefeller would go head-to-head with competition, Rockefeller normally wouldn't buy out the competition. He'd simply buy up the suppliers that were supporting the competition. Then, even if people decided to stay in the game, they had to realize at some point all they were doing was paying Rockefeller to let him keep playing. Rockefeller believed in competition. He enjoyed competition, but only to a point. Now, on the other hand, Rockefeller also quickly realized that it takes cash to grease the skids, especially the skids of business. And in the 1870s and 1880s, graft was the game that American politicians played, and nobody played that game better than John Rockefeller. Finally, Rockefeller had so many businesses that had been incorporated in one state, but were running concerns in so many others, that he had to pay off state governments to look the other way. He finally had to pay off enough of the federal government to where he could create the Standard Oil Trust. And all of these several businesses existed under the broader umbrella of Standard Oil. Rockefeller was making more money than he'd ever thought possible. When he was a young man, he'd said, "I only want to make $100,000 and live to be 100." Well, he was well over that in the cash end of things. And then came along Henry Ford and the American automobile industry. Do you remember all that gasoline that Rockefeller had been saving away for a rainy day? Well, with Henry Ford's Model T, America was now mobile, and mobile America needed gasoline. And Rockefeller had it by the gallon, and America ran on Standard Oil, as if Rockefeller weren't wealthy enough. But all good things must come to an end, and so it was with the Standard Oil Trust. During the administration of Theodore Roosevelt, trust busting was the thing to do. And the first trust that Theodore Roosevelt went after was that of his good friend John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil. The government dismantled Standard Oil into several parts: Esso, that became Exxon, Chevron, Mobil, Conoco, and several more. And Rockefeller, who owned 25% of the stock in Standard Oil, received a likewise amount of stock in each one of the separate businesses that had been formed out of what had been his trust. Now, unforeseen by anyone was the effect of the breakup of Standard Oil. Gas stations sprouted up all across America because of the automobile craze, and they were in competition with one another, and competition is good for business. And because Rockefeller owned 25% stock in every one of the companies, Rockefeller's financial portfolio would double in less than 5 years, making him one of the wealthiest Americans ever. John Rockefeller was an amazing dichotomy. He was the wealthiest man in America, probably the wealthiest man in the world. But he always felt that his financial ability had been a gift from the heavens, and he wanted to make sure that he was always square with the Lord. Rockefeller was a man that would, throughout his life, teach Sunday school and volunteer as a janitor at his local church. How many men that are worth $400 billion will do that? We'll be right back. This is History in the Highway on West Star Media. Let's talk about John Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan. He was a big man with a big personality and an even bigger nose. Made him a little bit testy. Now, Morgan got the advantage of the best private schools in the United States. He went to school and college in Europe, Switzerland, Germany, France, and England. And while he was there, he made the acquaintance and got the influence of every financial house that mattered in Europe. When he finally came back from the continent and started in banking, he was a well-placed but still just a young banker. But like they say, luck is when preparation meets opportunity. And when opportunity came across J.P. Morgan's desk, he was uniquely positioned to take advantage. He'd use his connections from overseas and his savvy business mind to make magic happen. It wasn't long before J.P. Morgan was one of the most sought-after business partners in New York. And in short order, Morgan's Bank, J.P. Morgan and Company, became the largest financial house this side of the Atlantic, with connections to every financial house of note in Europe. Morgan would run with the big dogs all of his life, and when the big dogs needed help, they turned to J.P. When the railroads were in financial crisis, it was Morgan that fished them out. It was Morgan that brought them together and made running the railroads fiscally profitable. When George Westinghouse needed money, needed capital for his business, it was Morgan that offered him a deal and put together General Electric, the most profitable utility company of the Gilded Age. It was Morgan who created U.S. Steel, the largest steel manufacturer in the world. But perhaps the greatest thing that J.P. Morgan ever did was pull the United States of America out of financial ruin, not once, but twice. The first time was in 1893. The panic then was caused because the American gold reserve had been depleted. Almost personally, Morgan put forward $65 million to save the United States gold reserve. And in the panic of 1907, it was Morgan and several others that put forward the money that saved the American banking system. When Morgan passed away in 1913, his net worth was counted to be $25 billion. Caused Andrew Carnegie to say, for all he did, and he wasn't even a wealthy man. Now, I don't know about you, but $25 billion, that's a lot of cash. Now, life wasn't always roses for Morgan. His shipping interest owned the White Star Line. It was one of several that they controlled. And the White Star Line was the operator of HMS Titanic. You remember, the ship that went down in April of 1912? Yeah, hit the iceberg. Well, Morgan was responsible for all the wrongful death suits that came forward. His company, his shipping company, was driven to bankruptcy because of that loss. But you got to understand, if John Pierpont Morgan was worth $25 billion, he controlled capital that was worth 100 times that amount. It was said of him, if he doesn't have the money, then he can lock all the rich men in America in his home until they'll do with their money what he tells them to do. In philanthropy, Morgan was almost unmatched. Over his lifetime, he had amassed an art collection that was worth almost $100 million. And upon his passing, he donated the whole of it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. At a time when the American dream was ripe for the picking, these boys went out and harvested, and harvest they did. Through their entrepreneurial and business savvy, they not only created wealth for themselves, but for the entire nation. These are the men that made the Gilded Age. These are the men that painted that picture that in America, anyone can be a millionaire. What these men truly did was lay the foundation for the American century. Thanks for joining us. This has been History in the Highway on West Star Media. Hey, if you like what you're hearing, you'll love what you see. Join us on History in the Highway on YouTube. We're on down the road, baby. See you next week.